The champagne flute was still cold against my fingers when Sloane Whitfield looked straight through me, lifted her chin toward a cluster of guests by the rose hedge, and said in a voice pitched to Carrie, "Oh, don't mind her. She's just the help. Somebody point her back toward the kitchen before she spills something on the linens." It was 4:52 on a Saturday afternoon in October. A string trio was playing something soft near the fountain. Golden light came sideways through the maples and turned the terrace the color of honey. I had a tray of empty glasses balanced on one hand because I'd been clearing them, the way I always clear them, the way you do when you've spent your whole life being useful instead of seen. 40 people heard her. A woman in a silk wrap laughed behind her hand. A man in a blazer glanced at me, then away, the way you glance at furniture. I set the tray down on the edge of the buffet table. I straightened the cuff of my plain navy dress, and I looked at the young woman about to marry the boy I raised, and I said, very quietly, "Of course." Nobody noticed the way I said it. 90 seconds later, the French doors at the far end of the terrace would open, and Sloane's father would step out into that honey-colored light, and he would stop walking entirely. And the most powerful family in 3 counties was about to learn that the woman they had just sent to the kitchen had once held their whole future inside her 2 hands. Welcome back to Quiet Defender Story. I'm Adele, I'm 57 years old, and for 26 years I carried a secret I never thought mattered. Until the afternoon a stranger's daughter tried to make me disappear at my own son's engagement party. This is the story of what I used to be, what they assumed I was, and the 90 seconds that rearranged an entire family. If you've ever been underestimated by people who never bothered to ask your name, stay with me to the end, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe so the next story finds you. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the party, the beginning. I grew up in a brick row house in a steel town that doesn't really make steel anymore. My father ran a hardware store, my mother kept the books and raised 4 of us on what the store didn't swallow. I was the second child and the quiet one, the kind of girl who took apart the toaster to see how it worked, and then put it back together so it ran better than before. We didn't have money for much, but we had a county library 2 blocks away, and I read every science book on the shelf, then read them again. When I was 9, a neighbor's baby turned blue in the night and an ambulance came, and I stood on the sidewalk in my nightgown watching the red lights spin and thinking, with a clarity that frightened me, I want to be the person who knows what to do. I became that person. It took 11 years of school, and a decade of work that ate my 20s, and most of my 30s, but I became a surgeon, not a general one, a pediatric cardiac surgeon, a person who repairs the hearts of children, hearts sometimes no bigger than a walnut, hearts that beat wrong from the very first second of a life. For 19 years I was Dr. Adele Marsh, and then I was the chief of the program I'd helped build from 2 operating rooms and a borrowed hope into one of the busiest children's heart centers in the region. I had a wall of photographs in my office, hundreds of them, kids who'd come to me dying and gone home to grow up. Birthday parties, soccer teams, graduation gowns, every one of them a morning I'd scrubbed in not knowing if I'd be enough. I tell you this not to brag. I tell you because by the time Sloane Whitfield called me the help, I had not introduced myself as Dr. Marsh to anyone in years. I'd let that name go on purpose. There's a reason, and we'll get there. I married late. His name was Walter Quinn, a high school chemistry teacher with a laugh like a screen door and a 7-year-old son named Daniel. Walter's first wife, Kara, had left when Daniel was barely walking. She wanted a different life than the one she'd built, and she went and found it 3 states away, and she did not look back. So when Walter and I married, the day Daniel handed me a dandelion he'd picked from a crack in the parking lot and asked if he could call me something other than Adele, I became a mother. Not a stepmother. A mother. I took Walter's name. I became Adele Quinn, and I kept being Dr. Marsh at the hospital. 2 names for 2 lives, and I never thought there'd be a day the 2 would collide on a terrace full of strangers. I retired at 51. People assumed it was burnout, and there's a sliver of truth in that. You cannot hold dying children for 19 years and walk away unmarked. But the real reason was Walter. He got sick, the kind of sick where you count time in seasons instead of years, and I decided I would rather spend his last seasons holding his hand than holding a scalpel. So I hung up the photographs in boxes and I came home, and I was Adele Quinn full-time, Daniel's mom, Walter's wife, the woman who made the soup and answered the door. Walter died in the spring 3 years before this story. Daniel and I buried him under a maple, and the two of us became a small, stubborn two-person family that loved each other without performing it. Daniel grew up like his father, a teacher, science again, ninth-grade biology at the public high school across town. He drives an 11-year-old hatchback and coaches the robotics club for free and brings me jars of honey from the bees he keeps behind the garage. He is, without exaggeration, the finest human being I know, and I take exactly zero credit for it, because the good in him was always his own. Then he met Sloane. He met her at a fundraiser, of all places. He'd been roped into chaperoning a museum gala because the science department got free tickets, and she was there in a green dress with her family, the Whitfields. If you live where we live, you know the name. Gerald Whitfield came up from nothing and built a development company that put up half the office parks and shopping centers and that gleaming hospital tower downtown. The irony of which I'll let sit for now. The Whitfields had the big house on the hill, with the gate and the long gravel drive, and the kind of money that makes people forget the years before they had it. Sloane was the youngest, the only daughter, 28, beautiful in the polished way that takes a team to maintain, and from the first week Daniel was halfway in love. I want to be fair to Sloane, because the easy thing is to make her a villain, and life is rarely that clean. She wasn't cruel by nature, she was frightened. She'd grown up in a house where worth was measured in square footage, and the right last names, where her mother, Vivian, kept a mental ledger of who mattered, and Sloane had learned to read that ledger before she could read books. When she looked at Daniel, she saw something she'd never been allowed to want. A man who was kind for no profit, who didn't care what she wore or who her father was. She fell for that. But she was also terrified of what her family would say about a public school teacher, with bees in his backyard, and a mother who used to be, as far as anyone in that house knew, a nobody. Because here is the thing. When Daniel introduced me to the Whitfields, 8 months before the party, I made a choice I've made my whole adult life. I didn't lead with the title. We were at a stiff dinner at the country club, white tablecloths, a waiter for every 2 guests, and Vivian Whitfield looked at me across the table and asked, "And what do you do, Adele?" in a tone that already knew the answer would disappoint her. I said, "I'm retired." I could have said, "I ran the Children's Heart Program at Mercer for 12 years. I could have watched her face change. But I have spent my life around people performing their importance, and I learned long ago that the moment you announce your worth, you hand it to other people to weigh. So I said, "I'm retired," and I let Vivian Whitfield decide I was small. She decided quickly. She turned to Sloane and started talking about florists. That was the night I understood what Daniel was walking into. Not just a marriage, a verdict. The Whitfields had already decided what we were. The teacher and his plain widowed mother in her sensible shoes. And Sloane, caught between the man she loved and the family she feared, started to do a thing I'd seen 100 frightened people do. She started to apologize for us, to smooth us over, to pretend, just a little, that we were less embarrassing than we were. It started small. The first family lunch, she introduced Daniel as an education, rather than a teacher, like the word itself was a stain. When Vivian asked where I lived, and I named our modest neighborhood, Sloane jumped in with, "But it's being revitalized," as though my home needed a defense. Daniel didn't notice. He's a man who assumes the best of people, which is his great gift and his great blindness. I noticed everything. I always have. You don't spend 19 years reading the faces of terrified parents in a surgical waiting room without learning to read a room like a chart. There was one afternoon that told me everything. Daniel had invited the Whitfields to our house. His idea, a brave one, an attempt to let them see where he came from instead of being ashamed of it. I cooked all day. I made my mother's pot roast and Walter's favorite bread, and I set the table with the good plates we'd gotten as a wedding gift, and the Whitfields arrived an hour late in a car that cost more than my house. Vivian walked through my living room running one finger along the bookshelf, and she picked up a framed photograph of Daniel at 7, gap-toothed, holding the dandelion, and she set it back down a 1/4 inch from where it had been, and she said, "How charming. It's also authentically modest." Sloane laughed too quickly. Gerald said almost nothing, ate 2 helpings of the pot roast, and at the door, on his way out, he paused and looked at me for 1 beat too long, like a man trying to remember where he'd seen a face. He couldn't place it. Not yet. He drove away, and Daniel washed dishes beside me in silence, and I knew that no amount of pot roast was going to make us legible to people who had already decided what we were. Over those 8 months, the slights stacked up the way they do. The engagement was announced. The wedding planning began, and I, the mother of the groom, was slowly edited toward the margins. The dress fittings happened without me. Oh, it was just a girl's thing. Adele, you wouldn't have wanted to be bored. The venue was chosen, and I learned about it from a save-the-date. Vivian took over everything with the smooth, total efficiency of a woman who has never once doubted her own taste, and Sloane let her, because letting her mother win was easier than the fight, and I understood that better than Sloane would ever know, because I'd let people win my whole life too. The difference was that I'd done it from strength, and she did it from fear, and that gap is everything. Daniel and I talked about it once, in the kitchen, the night the venue arrived in the mail. He was quiet over the honey jar, turning it in his hands. "They don't see you, Mom," he said finally. "I keep waiting for them to see you, and they just don't. They see what they expect to see," I told him. "That's not your job to fix. Your job is to love her, and to make sure she loves you for the right reasons. The rest is noise." "Does it bother you?" I thought about it honestly, the way I'd want a resident to think before answering. "No," I said, "but it tells me things. Watch what people do when they think you're no one. That's who they actually are." He didn't fully understand that yet. He would, soon. The engagement party was Vivian's masterpiece. Not Daniel and Sloane's, Vivian's. She'd taken the engagement that her daughter and my son had made between themselves and turned it into a production. 120 guests on the terrace of the Whitfield estate, a string trio, a champagne fountain, a tent in case the weather turned, an event planner with a headset and a clipboard. The whole valley's worth of important people were coming. Sloane had spent weeks anxious about it, and I knew her anxiety wasn't about flowers. It was about us, about what the room would think when it met the groom's side. I drove up that gravel drive at 3 in the afternoon in my navy dress. A good dress, a respectable dress, but not the kind of dress that says money, because I don't own one of those and never wanted to. I brought Daniel's late father's cufflinks in a small box, because I wanted my son to wear a piece of Walter at his engagement, and Walter would have liked that. I parked between a Range Rover and something Italian and low to the ground, and I walked up to a house I'd never been invited inside, and I found my place on the margin of someone else's party. Here is the part that matters, and I want you to see it clearly. I helped, of course I helped. I have helped at every gathering of my entire life. When the caterers were short, a pair of hands and a tray of glasses needed clearing, I cleared it, because standing useless while others work is a thing my body simply will not do. I have never in my life thought of work as beneath me. I once spent 14 hours straight on my feet rebuilding the aorta of a newborn, and then I went and got coffee for the exhausted parents myself, because the nurses were busy. Work is dignity. I believe that to my bones. So when a tray of empty champagne flutes was sitting forgotten near the buffet, and a caterer was clearly overwhelmed, I picked it up, and I was carrying it past the rose hedge, in my plain navy dress and my sensible shoes, when Sloane saw me. She was standing with a knot of her friends and a few of the valley's gleaming people, the kind of cluster that forms at parties around whoever has the most to prove. And there was her future mother-in-law, the groom's mother, carrying a tray of dirty glasses like a server. I watched it happen on her face, the flush of horror, the quick math of a frightened young woman, deciding that the cheapest way out of her embarrassment was to make me into someone else entirely. Not Daniel's mother, just staff, just background, just someone who could be sent away. And she said it. "Oh, don't mind her. She's just the help. Somebody point her back toward the kitchen before she spills something on the linens." I told you how that felt. The honey light, the laugh behind the silk, the man who looked at me like furniture. I set the tray down. I straightened my cuff. I said, "Of course," and I turned toward the house, not because she'd shamed me. At 57, with everything these hands have done, a frightened girl cannot shame me, but because I had decided, in that exact second, that I would not make a scene at my son's engagement. I would let her have her moment. I would go inside, and I would find Daniel, and I would put his father's cufflinks in his hands, and the Whitfields could think whatever they wanted to think. I was 3 steps from the French doors when they opened from the inside. Gerald Whitfield stepped out onto the terrace. He'd been somewhere in the house, on a call probably, the way men like him are always on a call, and now he came out into the late light buttoning his cuff, a big silver-haired man with a developer's heavy confidence, and he looked up to survey his daughter's party, and he saw me. And he stopped. I have seen a great many faces undergo a great many things. I have watched faces receive the best news of their lives and the worst. I know what it looks like when recognition hits a person somewhere below thought, in the body, before the mind has caught up. That is what happened to Gerald Whitfield's face. The confidence fell off it like a sheet pulled from a window. His mouth opened, his hand stopped on his cuff, and he said one word, very softly, in a voice I had not heard in 26 years. "Doctor?" The terrace didn't go quiet all at once. It happened in a ripple, the way silence spreads from a stone dropped in still water. The people nearest him heard the strange break in his voice and turned. Then the people near them turned. Sloane, 10 feet away, turned with her champagne still laughing on her lips. Gerald Whitfield crossed that terrace toward me, and the crowd did not part for him because for one of the only times in his adult life he was not the most important thing in the room, and he reached me, and this enormous, powerful man looked at me with eyes that had gone wet and bright, and he said, "Dr. Marsh. Adele Marsh, from Mercer. It's you. My God, it's you." I'll tell you now what he saw when he looked at me, because Sloane was about to learn it too, in front of 120 people, and it is the reason for everything. 26 years ago, Gerald Whitfield was not a man with a gait and a gravel drive. He was 34, a small contractor drowning in debt, with a young wife named Vivian, and 2 children and a third on the way that he could not afford. And his firstborn son, a boy named Marcus, 2 days old, was dying. Marcus had been born with his great vessels reversed, a heart plumbed wrong from the first beat, blue and failing in an incubator while machines screamed. 2 surgeons had already looked at the case and shaken their heads. The defect was severe. The baby was small. The odds were a sentence nobody wanted to say out loud. I was the 3rd surgeon. I was 31 years old and 3 years into my own career, and I looked at that ruined little heart on the imaging, and I knew the procedure that might save him, a long and brutal repair, and I knew that most people would not attempt it on a baby that fragile. I remember standing in the hallway outside that incubator, and Gerald Whitfield, young, broke, gray with fear, grabbing my forearm with a contractor's hard hand and saying, "Please, he's my son, please." And I said the only honest thing I had, "I will give him everything I have," and I scrubbed in, and I opened a chest the size of my palm, and for 9 hours I rebuilt the inside of a newborn, and somewhere in the 8th hour, his tiny heart took up its own rhythm under my fingers, and Marcus Whitfield lived. I came out of that operating room at 2 in the morning, and I found Gerald asleep sitting up in a plastic chair, and I woke him, and I said, "He's going to be okay. Your son is going to grow up." And that man came apart in front of me, the way only the saved ever do. He held both my hands and he wept, and he said he would never forget my face as long as he lived. He didn't. I lost track of the Whitfields, the way I lost track of nearly all of them, 600 families over 19 years. I could not carry them all, though I carried more than I should have. And Gerald went on to climb out of his debt and build his empire, and somewhere along the way the broke young father became the silver-haired king of the valley, and his wife learned to keep a ledger of who mattered, and his baby Marcus grew into a healthy man of 26, and his youngest, the daughter who'd been the one still on the way in that terrible week, the baby Vivian had been carrying through all those hospital hallways, that daughter grew up to be Sloane. Sloane Whitfield, who had just called me the help. Sloane, whose own life had been carried, before she was even born, in the waiting room outside the incubator where I saved her brother. Sloane, who owed the unbroken shape of her family, her brother alive, her father whole, the empire that bought her green dresses, to the plain woman in navy she'd just tried to send to the kitchen. She didn't know yet. She was about to. Gerald turned, still holding my hand in both of his, and his voice came out loud now, thick, public, the voice of a man who needs the whole world to hear what he is about to say. "This woman," he said, and the terrace went utterly still, "this woman saved my son's life. Marcus, 26 years ago, when nobody else would touch him, when 2 other doctors told me to go home and prepare myself, this woman opened my baby's chest, and she gave him back to me." His voice cracked clean in half. "I have looked for you. Do you understand?" For years I tried to find you, to say thank you, and the hospital said you'd left, and I never. Adele Marsh. You're standing on my terrace. 120 people were looking at me. The man in the blazer who'd glanced at me like furniture was staring now with his mouth open. The woman in silk had stopped laughing entirely. And Sloane had gone the color of paper. The champagne flute was tilting in her hand, forgotten, a thin line of it spilling down onto the linens she'd been so afraid I'd ruin. She was looking from her father's wet face to mine, and I watched the understanding arrive on her, the way understanding arrives on the very young when the world they built turns out to be made of nothing. Her mouth moved. No sound came out. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing. I'm human. There was a part of me, an old and tired part, that wanted to let Gerald's words just keep falling on her like rain. But I have stood in too many rooms where the floor dropped out from under a frightened person, and I know what mercy is for. So I did the thing I'd actually come to that party to do. I stayed gentle. Marcus, I said to Gerald, my voice even, how is he? Gerald let out a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. He's an engineer. He's getting married next spring. He's here, Adele. He's right inside. He came up from the city this morning. And he turned and called toward the house, and a tall young man with his father's shoulders came to the door, confused, and Gerald said, Marcus, this is the doctor. This is her. And the young man, who had no memory of his own first week of life, walked slowly out onto the terrace and looked at the stranger who had given him every day he'd ever lived, and the whole party watched a grown man's eyes fill as he reached out and shook the hand that had once held his heart. Vivian Whitfield had appeared in the doorway. I watched her take in the scene, her husband undone, her son weeping, her terrace silent, and at the center of it the plain widow she'd dismissed 8 months ago over florists. I watched the ledger in her head try to reweigh everything at once and fail. She put one hand to her throat. She did not say anything. There are humiliations that no amount of money can talk its way out of, and Vivian Whitfield was standing in one. And then there was the boy I came for, Daniel. He had come out onto the terrace somewhere in all of it. He told me later he'd heard the strange hush and come looking, and he was standing at the edge of the crowd, and he was looking at me with an expression I will keep until I die. He had known, in the dim way children know things, that his mom used to be a doctor. He had never known the rest. I had never told him, because it had never seemed to matter, because what is a wall of photographs to a boy who needs his soup made and his scraped knee cleaned? But he was looking at me now, this 31-year-old man who was the whole of my heart, and he understood for the first time who his mother had been before she was only ever his, and his face was breaking open with something so much bigger than pride. He crossed the terrace too. He didn't say a word. He put his arms around me, his chin on the top of my head, the way Walter used to, and into my hair he said, very quietly, only for me. You never told me. It wasn't the part that mattered, I said into his shoulder. It was always the part that mattered, he said. I just didn't need to know it to know you. That's my boy. Now you'll want to know what happened to Sloane, and the answer is the part of this story I'm proudest of, and it isn't the comeuppance you might be expecting. She came to me, not that night. That night she was too shattered, and rightly so, and I would not have wanted a performance of remorse in front of a crowd anyway. She came to me 4 days later. She drove her own car down the gravel drive and across town to my modest, revitalizing neighborhood, and she knocked on my door alone. No parents, no audience. And when I opened it, she was not the polished girl from the terrace. She had clearly not slept. Her hands were shaking. "Can I come in?" she said. I made tea, because that's what my mother did, and her mother before her. And we sat at my kitchen table, where Daniel and I had had 100 honest conversations, and Sloane Whitfield cried in a way that had nothing pretty about it. "I called you the help," she said. "I sent you to the kitchen. And you." She couldn't finish it. "My brother is alive because of you. My whole family is. My dad never recovered from that week. Do you understand? It's the thing under everything in our house. The fear of losing Marcus. And you're the reason it didn't happen. And I..." The words gave out. I let her cry. Then I said the thing I'd been deciding whether to say for 4 days. "Sloane, look at me." She did. "I didn't forgive you because of what I used to be. I want you to understand that. If I'd been exactly what you thought I was, a tired woman clearing glasses for a living, I'd still have deserved better than what you did. The reason it was wrong wasn't that you got the facts wrong about me. It was wrong because of how you treat people you think can't do anything for you. That's the whole test. That's the only test that's ever mattered." She nodded, wet-faced, and I could see it land in her the way truth lands, heavy, permanent. "I want to be different," she said. "I don't want to be my mother. I love Daniel because he doesn't care who anyone's father is. And I almost—" She pressed her hand over her mouth. "I almost became exactly the kind of person he'd be right to leave." "But you didn't almost," I said. "You did do it. You said the words. You don't get to skip past that part. What you do now is you spend a long time being the kind of person who would never say them again. Not to impress me. Not to impress him. Because you'd rather be that than the other thing." "How do I start?" I thought about it. "You can start by carrying your own glasses," I said. And for the first time in 4 days, the girl almost smiled. She married my son the following June. Not in the country club tent Vivian had been planning. In a garden. A real one. With Daniel's bees humming in the lavender, 100 fewer guests, and a great deal more truth. Sloane asked me, weeks before, if I would say a few words at the reception, and I did not mention a single thing about hearts or hospitals, because that was never the point. I talked about my son, and the dandelion in the parking lot, and what it means to choose a family on purpose. Gerald Whitfield found me after, by the lavender, with the bees. He'd aged into a gentler man over those months, or maybe just remembered who he'd been before the gate and the gravel, the broke young father who grabbed a stranger's forearm and said please. He told me Marcus had asked for my address. He told me Vivian had not slept well since the party, and I understood that to be the closest a woman like Vivian would ever come to an apology, and I let it be enough, because peace is worth more than a confession. "You let her off easy," Gerald said, watching Sloane laugh across the garden with my son. "My daughter. You could have ended her. On that terrace. In front of everyone. You had every card." "I wasn't playing cards," I said. He was quiet a while. Then he said, "I spent 26 years, thinking I owed you a thank you. I had it all rehearsed. And then you show up and you save her too, in a completely different way, and now I owe you twice, and I'll never be square." "You don't owe me anything, Gerald," I told him. "You never did. Watching that 2-day-old boy take up his own rhythm under my hands, that paid me in full. Every single one of them paid me in full." I looked out at the garden, at Marcus alive and laughing, at my son, at the frightened girl who was working, really working, to become someone better. This is just the part where I get to see how it came out. Here's what I know. After 57 years and 19 of them spent with my hands inside the chests of dying children. The world is full of people who will measure you by your shoes and your address and the title you lead with, and those people will always tell you exactly who they are by how they treat the person they think is nobody. The waiter, the cleaner, the plain woman carrying a tray. Watch what people do when they believe you can never repay them. That's the only honest measure of a soul there is. And here's the other thing. You do not need anyone in a room to recognize what you've done in order for it to have mattered. I'd have walked back into that kitchen and never said a word, and Marcus would still be alive, and those 19 years of mornings would still be the truest thing I ever did. Gerald's recognition didn't make my life worth something. It only let a room full of strangers catch up to a truth that was already finished. But I won't lie to you, there was a sweetness in it. A frightened girl tried to make me disappear, and instead the whole valley learned that the woman they'd sent to the kitchen had once given a dying baby back to his weeping father, and that baby grew up to be the brother she loved. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are carrying the heaviest things, and they carry them without ever once making you look. That's my story. A tray of empty glasses. 2 words from a man who remembered my face for 26 years. A girl who chose, in the end, to become someone better than her fear. And a boy who looked at his mother across a terrace and loved her exactly the same, before he knew, and after. If anyone's ever decided you were nobody before they bothered to learn your name, I want you to remember what you're actually worth has nothing to do with whether they ever find out. Share this with someone who needs to hear that today. Tell me in the comments about the time you were underestimated, and subscribe to Quiet Defender's Story, because there's another one coming, and I read every word you leave me. I'll see you in the next one.